Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. On paper, it sounds like the closest thing to a guaranteed business in America. The demand never goes away. Roughly 3.1 million people die in the US every single year, and that number never has a slow quarter. No fad, no seasonality, no competing with online shopping eating into your customer base. It looks recession-proof in a way almost nothing else in this series does. Here's the problem. One of the largest funeral home companies ever built, a business that once owned over 1,100 locations across North America, collapsed into bankruptcy anyway. So what actually happened? Here's the idea that explains almost everything else in this video. A funeral home isn't really selling caskets or cremations. It's selling decisions to people who have almost no time and almost no emotional bandwidth to shop around. And that single fact explains both how profitable this business can be and why the federal government eventually had to step in and regulate exactly how it's sold. There are three real versions here. A full-service funeral home, offering embalming, viewings, burial arrangements, and cremation under one roof, is the traditional model most people picture when they hear the word. A cremation-only provider, a newer and fast-growing format, operates with a fraction of the facility and staff a full-service home needs, since there's no embalming suite, no viewing rooms, and no large fleet of vehicles required to run it. And a combination operation, a funeral home paired with its own cemetery, captures revenue on both ends of the arrangement instead of referring cemetery business elsewhere and losing that margin to a competitor. This video is about the traditional full-service funeral home, still the backbone of the industry even as the other two formats grow around it. Total startup costs for a funeral home typically run $750,000 to $2.5 million, depending heavily on location and facility size. Property acquisition or a suitable building alone can run $250,000 to over $1 million. Embalming tables, refrigeration units, and preparation room equipment add another $50,000 to $200,000. Initial casket and merchandise inventory adds $30,000 to $100,000 on top of that. Add specialized state licensing, a vehicle fleet, and enough working capital to survive the 18 to 24 months it typically takes to reach a stable break-even, and this is a seven-figure commitment before a single family has walked through the door. Here's the structural fact that makes this business unlike almost anything else in this series. A gym or a coffee shop grows by convincing new people to become customers who weren't customers before. A funeral home can't do that. Its entire addressable market is fixed by the local death rate, a number that barely moves year to year and that no amount of marketing will ever meaningfully increase. Growth here comes almost entirely from taking market share away from competitors, not from growing the overall pool of people who will eventually need the service. That single structural fact is a large part of why this industry consolidated so aggressively over the last 40 years, and it's the reason a single well-placed acquisition can matter more here than in almost any other business covered in this series. The industry-wide average gross margin on a funeral home sits around 62.5%, a number that looks enormous the first time you see it, but net profit margins across the industry land far lower, typically 10 to 15%, with the strongest operators reaching closer to 20%. On an average funeral costing around $7,848, that works out to somewhere between $700 and $1,050 of actual profit per service. The gap between that 62.5% gross figure and the 10 to 15% that actually reaches the bottom line is staffing a facility around the clock, maintaining a fleet of vehicles that mostly sit idle, and carrying a large piece of real estate that generates revenue only when it's actually being used. There's a second pressure quietly reshaping this math every single year. The national cremation rate has climbed past 60%, and cremation packages are priced far below a traditional burial with embalming, a viewing, and a casket included. Every percentage point that shifts from burial toward cremation compresses the average revenue per case a little further, which is exactly why scale, more locations serving more families across a wider area, has become the industry's main answer to a shrinking per case margin rather than raising prices on the service itself. Before 1984, this industry operated with almost no federal oversight at all, and FTC investigations from that era documented exactly what happens when a business has a captive customer with no time to compare prices. Funeral homes routinely told grieving families that embalming was legally required when in most cases it wasn't. Prices were bundled into rigid packages that forced people to buy items they never wanted or needed, and in many local markets, funeral homes held something close to a monopoly entirely on casket sales, keeping prices artificially high because families genuinely had nowhere else to turn in the exact moment they needed to decide. The FTC's funeral rule ended most of that by law. Funeral homes are now required to hand over an itemized general price list on request, show a separate casket price list before a family even sees the caskets themselves, and give prices over the phone to anyone who simply asks. The only mandatory line item the rule permits at all is a single, non-declinable basic services fee. Everything else has to be sold and priced, item by item, a la carte. This isn't ancient history sitting quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere, either. The FTC has continued running undercover compliance inspections of funeral homes across multiple states in recent years, and it has brought cases as recently as 2022 against funeral and cremation companies accused of misleading families about pricing and even withholding remains to extract payment. A typical single-location funeral home generates around $1.09 million a year, serving somewhere between 113 and 200 families. At a 12% net margin, that's about $130,000 in annual profit, landing squarely inside the industry's real $109,000 to $218,000 range for owner-operators. The entire model rests on protecting that margin service by service, since discounting even a handful of arrangements a month, or losing families to a lower-cost cremation-only competitor down the road, moves the needle almost immediately. There's no slow season to make up the difference in later, and no viral marketing moment that could ever suddenly double demand the way it might for a retail business. Look at what happened to the Lowen Group. Founded from a single funeral home in Fort Francis, Ontario, it grew under founder Ray Lowen into the second-largest funeral home and cemetery operator in North America, eventually owning more than 1,100 funeral homes and 400 cemeteries across the continent. The growth engine was almost entirely acquisition, and almost entirely funded by debt, $620 million in acquisitions in 1996 alone, and another $546 million the following year. For a while, it worked beautifully. Wall Street loved the story, and Lowen stock traded as a genuine market darling through much of the mid-1990s. Then came a single deal in Mississippi. Lowen had agreed to combine funeral insurance operations with a local funeral home operator named Jerry O'Keefe, then backed out of the arrangement. O'Keefe sued for fraud and breach of contract, and a local jury awarded him somewhere between $100 and $400 million in damages, an amount large enough on its own to threaten the company's entire net worth. Lowen chose to settle rather than risk a full appeal, but the financial damage was already spreading through the company. By 1998, Lowen's total liabilities stood at 6 times the market value of its own equity. When a $17 million interest payment came due in June of 1999, the company didn't have the liquidity to cover it, despite sitting on roughly $30 million in cash reserves at the time. Lowen filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, needing $200 million in emergency debtor-in-possession financing just to keep operating through the restructuring. It emerged from bankruptcy in 2002 as a smaller company renamed Alderwoods Group, holding roughly half the locations it once had, before finally being acquired by its old rival, Service Corporation International, in 2006 for $1.2 billion. Nobody stopped dying during any of this. Lowen's core demand never wavered for a single day of the entire crisis. The company failed because a business built almost entirely on debt-financed acquisitions had no room left to absorb one large, unpredictable legal shock, and no matter how stable the underlying death rate is, a balance sheet leveraged 6 times over its own equity was never actually stable at all. In the good year, the local death rate holds steady as it always does. The service mix stays healthy with a reasonable share of traditional burials alongside a growing cremation share. Merchandise and vault add-ons are handled ethically and disclosed exactly as the funeral rule requires, and no compliance complaint ever reaches a regulator's desk. On $1.09 million in revenue, a 15% net margin puts about $163,000 in the owner's pocket for the year. In the realistic year, nothing dramatic happens at first. The cremation rate in the area ticks up another few points, quietly lowering the average revenue per case across the whole business. A new low-cost, cremation-only provider opens across town and picks off some of the most price-sensitive families before they ever walk in the door. A staff member misspeaks speaks about pricing during a routine family visit, triggering a complaint and a costly, time-consuming compliance review. None of it makes headlines on its own, but margin compresses from 15% towards something closer to 8% on that same $1.09 million in revenue, and the owner's take-home falls to around $87,000 for the year, a gap of $76,000 from the exact same building, serving the exact same number of families, in the exact same town. That's the business. Nobody is really buying a casket. They're buying permission to stop deciding for just one day. And that permission is worth exactly as much as the industry's own discipline and its own debt allow it to be.